I think it's a very interesting question. You know, do we focus on the positive and the hopeful, and when do we dig deep to recover the past or deal with those traumas? And I don't think it's an either or. I think it's both and. And one of the things I love about this psychology I work within is that we have to pay attention to the past, but not be driven by it. So what does that mean? It means in this psychological framework of psychosynthesis, it's much more about what's trying to emerge in my life, and how do I deal with my history in relation to that, rather than I've got to clear all this mess out first, which a lot of psychology is, for me, that's the ceiling they have, because it's very difficult then to go beyond that. So for me, it's all about a context. It's the context in our language. The context is this being, this self, who's really attempting throughout their lives to find their way. That's the key for me. In terms of, and can we support them to find their way, whether they're young people, in schools, as young adults, and seasoned adults that have got to change the way they live their lives because they know it lacks meaning and purpose. Now, if we do that, we look at what stands in the way of that, rather than let's clear the ground before we make that move. And part of that, and I think this is something for our society today. There's an existential dilemma that humanity has, society has, particularly across the world. It's not just whether it's more developed and less developed nations. There is a real existential crisis. And as you know, in any existential crisis, it's not about fixing the problem so much as wondering about that existential crisis and saying, what's trying to come in here? What's trying to emerge? And I'll touch on that when we talk about adolescence, because that's an absolutely fundamental existential crisis for me. If we do that, then we start holding the individual and the world in which they live in a very different way. And personally, I think more compassion comes in because we see much more about the whole rather than just trying to fix the past. And continuing to work with cause and effect, which we know doesn't work. The psychological language we use around mental health, I think, has to change completely. From a language of history, which is where many of our psychologists have a ceiling, which says that you have to fix problems within a medical or close to a medical model and work that out before you can actually realize yourself. I would turn it around the other way. For the majority of people, to say the language is one of where are you going in your life? How can you do the very best you can be for yourself, and within that work out any history that gets in the way? And that language is completely different. It's moving from pathology to what I would call serving self. And we have you may not want to know this, but we've developed a model that deals with just this in terms of different levels of suffering. So.